The philosopher and activist Dr. Cornel West says that the test of any democracy is its relationship to the most vulnerable among its population. As an educator, an artist, an activist, an organizer myself, I want to take Dr. West's test and apply it to schools and school systems. And we want to think about how the test of any school system should be its relationship to the most vulnerable students. When we think about the most vulnerable students, historically we're talking about low-income students and students of color who traditionally have been talked about as being at the bottom of the achievement gaps, having the lowest rates of graduation, and not coincidentally being in the lowest resource schools. So whenever I enter a conversation about education, I always want to enter that conversation through the lens of the most vulnerable students. So a few years ago, I'm teaching, and I had a young student named James, a young African-American student, 8th grader. And by all accounts, James was not having a successful educational experience. He rarely came to school, only to kind of avoid being put on truancy lists, failing all of his classes, always caught up in the disciplinary mechanisms of school, suspensions, detentions. By all accounts, James would be the typical kind of student that would end up falling through the cracks of the education system and limiting his life chances. At the same time, I was running with a colleague an African-American boys leadership group, and where we tried to focus on academic and social leadership skills, but we interacted with our students through a cultural context of youth culture and particularly hip-hop culture. So through that context, we tried to engage our students and motivate them, and we also brought in an aspect of ethnic studies and African-American history that's typically left out of the traditional curriculum. So James joined our group, and we're doing an activity around African history, and James began to take over the activity. And it turns out that James had this wealth of knowledge about African history. So I talked to him afterward, and I said, James, how'd you learn all this stuff? And he said to me, well, Mr. L, I like to read a lot. And I like to study things about African history. So I said to him, well, James, all right, obviously you're really intelligent and you're doing all these things outside of school. Why are you having so much difficulty in school? This honestly should be pretty easy for you. And I'll never forget, he looked right at me and he said, this is just not for me. I want to let that sink in a little bit. He said, this is just not for me. And it shook me a little bit. Not that I was under some illusion that school, represented every student's life and was, every student kind of like loved being there, but more how intentional he was about his resistance and about his critique of school. He wasn't just not doing well in school because he couldn't, right? James was not doing well because he said, I don't really accept what it is that you're offering me in terms of my education and my intellectual development. So I'm going to pass on this, and I'm going to look for my intellectual development outside of school. So it got me thinking about, well, how many other students like James are we missing? How many students like James are forced to go outside of school for their primary intellectual development because they believe that school is just not for them? And I began to think about resistance and how schools deal with youth resistance. And traditionally and sadly, we usually suppress it, right? We kind of say, well, there's not really that much wrong with school. There's usually more something wrong with you, right? You're not smart enough. You don't come from a family that values education, right? You don't work hard enough. All of these kind of ways of looking at the deficits of young people. And then these students kind of get sucked into the underbelly of school, right? And a lot of us probably haven't experienced this underbelly, but remedial courses. And we kind of do this horrible doubling down on students like, so you're not really doing well in your math class. It's not really too effective for you. I know. Let's give you 2 math classes that are ineffective, right? So we do this weird doubling down, and there is an answer, right? There's another model, a more progressive model of education that says, no, well, teachers need to be a little more, they need to be more relevant in how they interact with students. We need to broaden our curriculum and be more, bring in more multicultural things. We need to be more critical and draw from youth experiences. And this is really important. This is the work that I've invested a lot of my educational career into promoting. But I don't know if we're necessarily getting at everything that has to do with youth resistance. So when I think about resistance, first thing I think about are content and teaching, right? What it is that we're teaching and how we're teaching it. And the progressive model tries to address this, right? It says, well, we need to rethink what it is that we're trying to teach students and how we're interacting with them. But what's left out of the conversation is the structure of education. And what I mean by structure, I mean the mechanisms of schooling. And it could be something as simple as the typical classroom or bell schedules, right? These ways that we kind of segment education and we kind of try to break up and manage how students think about things, right? So you're allowed to start thinking about something, and then when the bell rings, you have to stop and move on to another classroom. You're thinking about a totally different subject, and there's no way that those two classrooms interact with each other. And I think some students are not necessarily rejecting the content and the teaching, but they may be rejecting the structures because they don't want to operate that way. There's another idea with content and teaching, too, in that a lot of times what's promoted as the goal of school is this idea of like knowledge acquisition and skill acquisition, right? That we're going to graduate and we've got this like breadth of knowledge and all of these things that we can do so that then we can go out and become more productive workers, right? And that seems to be what's kind of driving this. I want to suggest that maybe we don't retain as much content knowledge as we think we do. My evidence, you might ask, my evidence would be something like, are you smarter than a fifth grader, right? The reason that television show works is because the adults don't retain the content knowledge from fifth grade, right? And I'd argue probably 3 or 4 years later, those same fifth graders wouldn't have retained that content knowledge. So what is it that we actually do retain from school? We retain habits of thinking, right? And ways of participating in schooling or in our educational process. So what we learn to do is to participate in education in these kind of segmented, regimented ways. And I'd argue that most of us that do really well in that environment have learned to participate. We've learned to kind of do these things, break apart disciplines and all those kind of things. And the students who don't want to or have trouble doing that, they're less likely to be successful because we only really offer them that one avenue for their educational experience. So what I want to suggest is, what would happen if we kind of reverse the poles of education? So what I mean by this, instead of focusing on knowledge acquisition and skill acquisition as the main goal of school, what if we focused on ways of participation as the main focus of school? And rather than focusing and trying to diversify content knowledge, we diversified the avenues that we offer for students to participate. And I'll show you what I mean. So right now you have the traditional classroom model. Typically, in most public schools, this is the only avenue, the only way to participate in school is to be in the traditional classroom model with a student, with a teacher at the front, right, doing all kinds of activities and teachers doing wonderful things in this model. But this is really the only avenue. What I want to suggest is, what would happen if we decentered the traditional model and open up avenues for other models of education to kind of take shape and take form in our schools and outside of schools? I'm not suggesting we get rid of a traditional classroom model. What I'm suggesting is that we offer more alternatives. And these are not just educational models that kind of come up out of the blue. These are evidence-based tested models of education that in a lot of cases are shown to work better for struggling students. So things like ecological education, where students use their environment as the classroom. And this kind of already breaks up those strict disciplines and ways that students are able to move, right? And breaks up that idea of time, that you're only allowed to think about something for a certain amount of time. Or something like youth action research, this is what I do, where a student's local community becomes their unit of analysis for thinking about all kinds of real-world problems. And not only thinking about them, but then taking steps to act upon them. All of these kind of problem-posing models. It doesn't eliminate content and skill acquisition because you have to have that in order to participate in these different ways. What I'm suggesting is if we were focused on offering multiple avenues of participation, students may be able to see themselves then outside of just the one model that we currently offer. So when you think about James and his idea that this is just not for me, I think that there's something really important there that we have to get at. And we have to take his critique and all youth resistance very seriously if we're going to try to create a more inclusive and better education system. Because inherent in any form of learning is this kind of leap of faith, right? There's this unknown that we need students or anyone to be able to kind of take. I want to put that back on us and say that we also need to be able to take a leap of faith and reimagine another way of working in our education system so that one day you'll see James standing up here on the stage showing you his ideas and showing you his brilliance. Thank you.